Another month has passed. Here are the 8 books I read in March. I'm Veronica, and this is the Reading Chronicles. The first is The Seven Daughters of Dupree by Nikesha Elise Williams, and this was published in 2026. In fact, this is another book that was on my January 5 books I'm excited for list. Now, here we have 7 generations of the Dupree women: Evangeline, Emma, Jubilee, Ruby, Gladys, Nadia, and Tatiana, who goes by Tati. The main driver of the story is that at 14 years old, Tati wants to finally know who her father is. She's been raised by her mother Nadia and her Mimi Gladys her entire life, and no matter how much she asks, her mother won't talk to her about the man who gave her the other half of her life. Now, this prompts a look back at the 7 generations of these women, going all the way back to the one who originally arrived on American shores in an African slave ship. Now, the book's prologue actually gives the first clues as to what happened to this woman, saying they cut off her head because she ran. Now, an effort to finally find out who her father is, and going behind her mother's back to do so, the story of the Dupree women will unravel. From that first woman who ran, to Gladys, who left their family's home in Alabama to start a new life in Chicago, which is where Nadia and Tati live. Now, I've said before that I love a multi-generational family saga, and that is exactly what we got here, but I didn't love it as much this time. And I think that's owing to the structure. Now, Williams weaves in and out between these women's stories, making it hard to follow which generation we're in at any given time. I had to keep looking back at the inside cover pages to remind myself of who was whose mother, grandmother, daughter, and so on. And it's not that I feel like I shouldn't have to do any work to understand a story, but when I think back on the multi-generational family sagas I've loved, they've spent significant amounts of time in one generation's story before moving to the next, which makes the lineage a little bit easier to trace. Now, this is true of Homegoing, this is true of Pachinko, it's true of Roots. It's also true of The House of the Spirits, and I have the Spanish version, La Casa de los Espíritus, and it's also true of 100 Years of Solitude. Again, I have Cien Años de Soledad. But this story is confusing for a different reason, and I really think Gabo did that on purpose, so he wanted this one to be hard. I find I'm taken out of the story when I have to constantly think about its structure and refer to a chart to remind me of when we are. And I was also a little bit confused about the use of the curse as a plot point. So the Dupree women are supposedly cursed to give birth to only daughters, but Gladys has 2 sons. And I thought we were going to find out they were adopted, but she gave birth to them. And the only explanation we're given for that is that the curse was somehow broken at that point. And for this to be as important to the story as it was a little underdeveloped. That said, I do think Williams did a fine job of touching on historical issues that continue to affect us today, especially those that stem from generational trauma of being the descendant of an enslaved person. Hair also plays a big role in the story, with Jubilee hating that her daughter does her hair in intricate braids. And Gladys is aghast when Nadia decides to pursue doing hair as a career. Hair has always been a point of contention in the African American community, but we learn specifically why that is so for this family, and the reason has true historical roots. The issue of colorism is also explored here, with many of the women being light-skinned, and historically we know why this happens, and with Jubilee being so light-skinned that she attempts to pass as white. However, when Ruby comes out of her many shades darker, Then both of her parents, Jubilee, can no longer hide who she really is. And given that this happens in the early 1900s, we can imagine that this did not turn out well. There is also the issue of men and their actions or inactions surrounding the women they claim to love and the children they bear. Now, not every man in this novel is trifling, but some of them most certainly are. Ultimately, Tati learns the origins of her birth, and what she comes to realize is that Nadia was always enough. Gladys was always enough. The women of the Dupree family have always been and will always be enough for each other. And while I may not have loved this story the way I've loved others of this genre, I wouldn't discourage anyone from reading it. Next, I listened to Finlay Donovan is Killing It, published in 2021, written by Elle Cosimano and narrated by Angela Daw. Now, I haven't had too much luck with audiobooks lately, and part of me was starting to wonder if I was prejudicing my opinions of these books by consuming them on audio. With the exception of a few authors, it's not exactly my favorite way to take in a book. But I'm happy to say that this book proved that suspicion wrong, because I actually really enjoyed the story of a bumbling Finlay, who is a single mother who gets caught up in a murder-for-hire plot straight out of one of her novels. And Angela Daw does a fantastic job of narrating the story. When we meet Finlay, she's trying to get her 2 young children fed and ready for the day, which includes trying to reattach the hair her daughter has cut off with duct tape, and she's surprised to find that her nanny, Vero, won't be coming over. It turns out that her ex-husband, Steven, has let the nanny go. After all, Finlay works from home. Why can't she just watch the kids? On the day that Finlay is late for the meeting with her agent, she drops off the kids at Steven's, races to Panera, where she's been banned for a previous outburst, and starts talking about the suspense novel that she's late on delivering. Finlay is mostly worried about being discovered by the Panera staff, but then a strange woman drops a note on her table, and the note says that this woman's husband must be stopped and offers Finlay $50,000 to do it. Finlay realizes what's happened. The woman has mistaken her as a contract killer. Now, the logical thinking would be to discard the note and not get involved in any of this, right? But then, would we have a story? Of course not. So the first thing here is that you have to be willing to suspend your disbelief that your everyday working woman would willingly get involved in a murder-for-hire scheme, no matter how late on their bills they might be. And while Finlay's not entirely sure that she's capable of killing someone, she does stake out and interact with the husband, and over the course of the evening, he ends up dead. And instead of going to her cop sister, Georgia, for help, she decides to get rid of the body with the help of Vero, who unwittingly sees what Finlay's up to and demands a cut of the money to buy her silence. Now, the two become fairly effective partners throughout the story, and together they find that the issue goes far deeper than one woman's abusive husband. Overall, I found the story to be quite amusing. Did I laugh out loud? No, this isn't Psych, but it was a fun way to pass the time at the gym. There is, of course, the requisite love interest, 2 of them, in fact, in the form of bartender/law student Julian and the cop who is assigned to the case, Nick, who is also a co-worker to Georgia, both of whom could really spell trouble for Finlay's not in prison status. And I don't really need any of that, but I can't be mad that it's there because I'm apparently one of very few readers who doesn't love a good love polygon. Now, somehow I didn't notice that this was the first in a series when I marked it on Storygraph, but now that I know, this will be something that I come back to when I'm in need of a breather between more serious books. And the future books have earned a spot in my physical reading time. Next, I read El Problema Final, or The Final Problem in English, and this was by Arturo Pérez-Reverte, translated by Francis Riddle and published in 2023. I read the Spanish version, and I really enjoyed this book. Now, I've said before that while I love the Sherlock Holmes series, you can see him here, and then my complete works here. I have another complete works up there somewhere. So while I love the Sherlock Holmes series, I'm not a fan of books that try to reimagine that with other characters. But this book was something different. Set in 1960, our protagonist is Ormond, or Hopalong Basil, an aging British film star who is most known for portraying the famous detective in 15 movies. So Basil decides to take a solo trip to a Mediterranean island where he finds himself with 8 other people and the small staff that runs the hotel where they're staying. There are Hans and Renate Klemmer, a German couple, the couple Pietro Malerba and Najat Farhala, not sure if I pronounced that correctly, Edith Mander and Vesper Dundas, 2 female friends traveling together. There's Dr. Carabin, dime store novelist Paco Foxa, as well as hotel owner Raquel Auslander and the employees Evangelia and Spiros. So Basil is a bit dismayed with the fact that he's only recognized for playing Sherlock Holmes, and his work in films like War and Peace go largely unnoticed. But still, he indulges Foxa's interest in his work, and the two amiably trade quotes from the mystery series that they both love. However, when one of the guests mysteriously turns up dead, found in a room locked from the inside, and the police are unable to access the island due to a raging storm that is expected to last several days, they all turn to Basil to figure out who is the culprit in this classic whodunit locked room murder mystery. So the idea here is, of course, preposterous. It would be like winding up on vacation with James Roday Rodriguez and expecting him to solve a murder. Yes, I know Benedict Cumberbatch and Robert Downey Jr. would probably be the more appropriate comparisons here, but I prefer to think of myself somehow ending up on vacation with Sean Spencer. And of course, Bruton Gaster. Anyway, despite his initial protestations, Basil eventually agrees to put his learned, if pretend, sleuthing skills to work and starts investigating the crime with the help of Foxa, his self-proclaimed Watson. So the story is told from Basil's point of view, and I really enjoyed that we got to see how his ego was clearly stroked by everyone putting their trust in him. He uses his knowledge of mystery stories to investigate the crime, and he and Foxa bounce ideas off of each other, with Basil occasionally taking the pretentious position of resting his elbows on an armchair and joining his fingertips under his chin as he thinks, knowing how much he is imitating the classic positions and gestures of Holmes in those stories. And he reminds the group that what characterizes Holmes is not his way of fighting crime, but his way of thinking, and that they should all try to think like him in the moment. I will say, I did not guess the culprit here. As the situation ramps up and clues are left that clearly indicate the murderer is toying with Basil and his connection to Holmes, several suspects come to the forefront, but I did not guess the correct one or the reason for the crime. So much in the vein of the Holmes stories, a lot of the figuring out of the mystery is interior. It happens in Basil's head, and he explains to the murderer and us what he's deduced and how. Unlike other stories that try to recreate the Holmes and Watson relationship, this one is very much in conversation with it, paying homage to it, and showing that the author clearly loves the classic detective duo just as much as his characters do. So this is the first of Pérez-Reverte's work, extensive body of work that I've read. I've sort of passed over his books that I've seen to be kind of a swashbuckling adventure or war type, but I may take a closer look at them now to see if something else appeals to me. I found the writing always engaging and the Spanish not all that difficult for me to follow, and I think anyone who enjoys a classic mystery plot could not go wrong with this book. My next listen was Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins, narrated by Jefferson White and published in 2025. Okay, I did it. I listened to Sunrise on the Reaping. And you know what? I didn't hate it. So for those living under a rock or just not in touch with popular culture in any way, this is the second Hunger Games prequel, this time focusing on Hamish Abernathy's role or run in the 50th annual Hunger Games. So after absolutely hating the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, I was hesitant to jump back into the series that the author and publisher seem to be milking for all it's worth. But I do actually like the character of Hamish, and with the movie set to come out later this year, I bit the bullet. So here's what I liked about the story. Hamish is a much more interesting character and much more sympathetic than Snow, which made me want to know his backstory. How did someone who is initially presented to us as an apathetic drunkard in the first book win their Hunger Games? So we come to see in the initial series that winning the games does not guarantee a life of happiness despite all the riches that come with it, and here we see exactly why that is. We see what happens to him in the games, this time taking in twice as many participants for the second quarter quell, and what happens afterward. We also get callbacks to some characters who appeared in the initial series, and I won't say their names here to avoid spoiling that, but while I wish their parts had been more developed, I simply liked being with those characters again. I can imagine Collins continuing this series by focusing on more of the characters she introduced the first time and fleshing out their backstories so we see their relationship to the games. I don't know if that would be a good thing or a bad thing, but I wouldn't be surprised if that happened, and I have in mind exactly who she would start with first. So, while I am averse to any sort of romance in the books, because Hamish isn't a terrible human being like Snow, I also didn't find it to be a cheap ploy to get us to feel something for him. I buy that he loved a person and that he thought of her as more than something to possess. And because we were with Hamish in the arena, this had more of the feeling of the original Hunger Games books than Songbirds and Snakes did, which had us largely looking at the games outside in. So here's what I didn't like. Any reference to anything that happened in Songbirds and Snakes, particularly when posed as a question such as Hamish wondering what happened to District 12's only victor. We know what happened. It's not an interesting question. The way that Collins tries to build suspense throughout the book is also wanting. Will Hamish get picked at the reaping? Will he survive? We know those answers already. The question here is not what happens, but how it happens. And I really think this book could have benefited from being told in the past tense rather than the present. Having Hamish remember and tell us his story would have been more effective than trying to put us in the moment as if we didn't know how this would ultimately turn out. I also found Collins' reliance on a very famous poem to be trying. I know this is a series for young adults, but this is a poem that I think most American students encounter in middle school, and referring to it so many times throughout the text just made it seem like Collins was incapable of reaching beyond very basic literary knowledge to give her story meaning, or didn't trust her readers to understand something they hadn't already been exposed to. I also found the fact that everyone seems to be fighting against the capital to be a bit repetitive, but I guess this is a necessary factor if we're going to tell this story from the point of view of the oppressed. Ultimately, this is far from my favorite in the series, but I also didn't hate reading it or listening to it. Jefferson White did a really great job with the narration, and he's also going to be in the movie. I don't quite remember what role he is, but he will be in the movie. So I will see this movie, and liking the book or not hating the book and wanting to see the movie are two things that I can't say about songbirds and snakes. I'm a bit sad to know that some of the actors who I really loved in the original movies, who I discovered and came to fall in love with in the original movies, can't return here because they can't play a younger version of themselves, but we'll see how things shake out. Next, I read When We Were Orphans by Kazuo Ishiguro, published in 2000. So I'll put this in a longer video on the book for my Year of Kazuo Ishiguro reading series, but here's a brief summary. So in this book, we meet Christopher Banks in 1930. As the son of English people and having been raised in Shanghai, he was transported back to England after the mysterious disappearance of his parents when he was a child. These many years later, he's fulfilled his dreams of becoming a detective, and a quite recognized one at that, but he still hasn't solved the mystery at the center of his life. Steeped in the theme of the unreliability of memory, a theme that I'm coming to learn permeates all of Ishiguro's work, the book follows Christopher as he attempts to finally unravel his past and pave a way for his future. Find out more in a later video what I really thought of Ishiguro's fifth book. Next was The Renovation by Kenan Orhan, published in 2026, and this is the first of my February 5 exciting new books reads. So, living in Italy with her husband and father after having been exiled from Turkey, Delara is surprised to find that the work being done in her apartment has left her not with a new bathroom, as expected, but with a cell in a maximum security Turkish prison. There's no explanation for this accident, as she calls it, and the builders don't respond to her calls. The development is particularly distressing because the bathroom needed to be remodeled owing to her father coming to live with her and her husband. Either experiencing Alzheimer's or some form of dementia, her father is no longer able to live on his own, and the main bathroom has become cluttered with his pills and medical devices, and Delara and her husband have decided to expand the main bedroom to include a bathroom. When she discovers what's really been left behind, Delara tries to hide it from her husband, but that can only go on for so long. When he finally finds out what's behind the tarp, he leaves and is shocked to find that Delara isn't leaving with him. The bulk of the novel is Delara dealing with this prison that has inexplicably become attached to her home, a prison that the character in the novel is experiencing on a literal level, but that quickly becomes a metaphor for so much more in her life. I don't know much about the political situation in Turkey, so I'm certain that I'm missing a lot of the context for the story. And I also found it difficult to find an overview of Erdogan's presidency. I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. Aside from going to his Wikipedia page, whose accuracy I don't necessarily trust for current issues. But what I've gathered from the book is that this is a sort of autocratic rule, with many citizens being jailed or run out of the country for fear of speaking out or for having spoken out. And Delara's husband reminds her that they've been driven out of the country, with her father's name appearing on a list of hundreds of professors throughout the country who were purged from their positions by presidential decree. Delara was subsequently fired from her own position working in a hospital as a supposed precaution due to her ties with her dissident author father. She recounts that while she didn't consider herself to be particularly political, Even she couldn't miss the government slide into authoritarianism, the rampant police brutality, the trampling of human rights, the insidious infiltration of religious nationalism. The truth is, wherever Delara is, she feels as if she is in a prison, whether in her home country that threatens to jail citizens who speak out, or in exile in Italy, a country that is not hers and whose language she has had to learn. And even, or perhaps most especially at home, where constant care for her father leaves her unable to think about or do much else. In fact, it is only in the prison cell that has appeared in the bathroom that she starts to feel a little bit free. What really surprised me about the book was that the author is male and yet seemed to capture a woman's point of view perfectly. At one point, Delara remembers how her father hated the return of the headscarf and that she hated it too, saying she hated how easy it was to fall into a misogynistic dichotomy of headscarf or anti-headscarf, how easy it was to politicize hair regardless of what you believed, and how absolutely impossible it was to be a woman and exist without its politics. But I hated most of all how many women were never given a true choice in this country. That seems to me to be such an accurate capturing of how it feels to exist as a woman in a society that devalues women, something that many men, regardless of how woke they may be, simply don't think about because it's not something they have to confront. I would certainly like to know more about why he chose to make the protagonist a woman and how he was able to capture women's experiences in a way that feels so real. This is a short novel, not even 300 pages, but it does well to borrow from the traditions of magical realism to use what cannot be true to show what is undeniably true. My next listen was The Third Gilmore Girl by Kelly Bishop, narrated by Kelly Bishop, and published in 2024. There are some ways in which I am just basic, and one of those is I love Gilmore Girls. I was in college when it debuted, and although I didn't start watching it regularly until the second season, I feel like one's age and maturity can be traced by how one feels about the principal characters. Many of us adored Rory and highly identified with her introverted and bookish ways when we were young, and then fell out of love with her as she began making less intelligent choices and her complete lack of self-confidence became apparent. Lorelai seemed like the coolest mother and a best friend to her daughter until you realize that in many ways Lorelai was far more of a child than Rory and completely self-centered. And then there's Emily. We're certainly not meant to like Lorelai's demanding and uptight mother, but it's only when you get older that you realize that Emily is in fact the best character. Did she do everything right? Of course not. But she is the character who goes through the most growth throughout the series, whose tension between what she believes is right and what is actually right is always at odds, and who, by the time you're well past Lorelai's age, yikes, you understand the most. So, of course, I was going to read or listen to Kelly Bishop's memoir. I will say that there are two good ways celebrity memoirs can go. One way is to provide a deep dive into the thing they're most known for, giving fans a behind-the-scenes look at their work and reveal juicy secrets. And the other way is to stay mostly away from that thing and to provide insight into other aspects of their lives. An example of the latter that comes to mind is Simu Liu's memoir, We Were Dreamers, which is largely about emigrating from China as a child and his contemptuous relationship with his parents, and ends just as he gets the part of Shang-Chi in the MCU. And I highly recommend listening to that on audio. I dare you not to cry. So this book, The Third Gilmore Girl, is neither of those. It pains me to say, but it's the third type of celebrity memoir, one that is far more common, that provides a general overview of a person's life and career with little depth. In the book, we learn about how Kelly, born Carol, but who later changed her name to be able to enter the Screen Actors Guild, how she grew up with an alcoholic father, about whom the most she can really say is that at least he didn't hit her, and whose mother told her that freedom ends when you have children. Kelly fell in love with the ballet young, and she eventually made her way to Broadway as one of the originating performers of A Chorus Line. We learn about her relationships, her first disastrous marriage, of which she has the temerity to say that she thought she could fix him, her affair with a married man, and her eventual second successful marriage to the man who would leave her a widow. We learn of her pregnancy and her abortion, and her decision to get her tubes tied to prevent that from ever happening again, with her lauding Planned Parenthood and feeling fortunate to have had this happen in a time when abortion was legal. We learn of her break into screen acting and her eventual audition for Gilmore Girls, although surprisingly little time is spent on her work on the series. We also learn of her post-Gilmore Girls life and her being invited on stage by the Hamilton cast as they paid homage to A Chorus Line, and her lauding one of the performers, reminding herself not to feel bad that she's no longer a younger person up on stage, but to feel happy that she was once that person. In all, it's a perfectly fine memoir, just a bit shallower than I would have liked. I don't think this one will stay with me the way others have, but I can't hate having Kelly Bishop in my ears again, and she will forever remain my favorite Gilmore Girl. Last is I Told You So, Scientists Who Are Ridiculed, Exiled, and Imprisoned for Being Right by Matt Kaplan, also published in 2026, and this is also on my February 5 books I'm excited for list. So we may think we're in a new age of anti-science, but what Kaplan shows is that this has kind of always been the case, grounding his book by tracing the work of Ignaz Semmelweis. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I should have looked up the pronunciation first. Semmelweis, a Hungarian physician who struggled to prove that doctors were spreading a deadly infection by not washing their hands in between touching cadavers and delivering babies. Kaplan takes a look at how the scientific community can itself be anti-science and resistant to change for reasons far greater or far less than ego. I would describe this book as a science book for people not really into science. Take that as a compliment or not, as you will. Essentially, Kaplan writes with a nose for humor to keep readers who may otherwise find an in-depth look at science boring. This is kind of pop science, but that doesn't mean that it's not valuable. Kaplan does well to call out the fact that being from a different country, not speaking the right language, which nowadays is English, or being a woman are all impediments to having one's work believed and invested in. There is the need to satisfy the egos of those more powerful in educational institutions, and the need to constantly apply to or for grants to fund one's work. There is the belief that a study that finds nothing is not a worthwhile study, while real scientists know that disproving a hypothesis is just as valuable as proving it. This is perhaps most notable to us today in the case of Katalin Karikó, a Hungarian scientist whose work with messenger RNA had her at odds with the university higher-ups, but would earn her a Nobel Prize for its contribution to the COVID-19 vaccines. On the flip side, Kaplan also works to show that scientists who we revere, such as Louis Pasteur, were egomaniacs driven by glory rather than scientific advancement. And for all scientists may bemoan having their work interrupted by the obligation to teach, he highlights the importance of interacting with students, as it was the students of Joseph Lister in the 1870s who spread his antiseptic techniques throughout England, Scotland, and Wales. And this was years after Semmelweis's work led him to developing a mental health condition that some say was bipolar disorder, and Kaplan thinks that is likely, and being committed to a sanatorium and dying. All because he thought doctors probably shouldn't touch a cadaver and then shove their hands up a birth canal. What I didn't quite like about this book was the style of storytelling, of constantly interrupting the telling of one scientist's story to switch to another and back again, and also having Kaplan insert himself into the narrative. I get it. We're in an age in which attention is scarce and focus is fractured, and you're doing whatever you can just to get people to read the book. But I'm of the opinion that if you're writing a book, your audience is already people who want to do that, who want to read a book, who have the focus to go more than a few pages without having to be attracted to something new. And perhaps if there had been longer stretches centering on each scientist, I wouldn't have felt the focus to be so scattered. I do, after all, love a story told from multiple perspectives, but here it just seemed to me that the goal was to capture the interest of as many people as possible, and in an effort to do so, the book is less demanding than it could have been. Of course, that's my opinion. I do see the value in trying to get people to realize how ego-driven the science community is, and that we all suffer when science itself is no longer the goal. Those were my 8 reads for March. Have you read any of these books? And what were your favorite reads for the month? Let me know in the comments. See you in the next video.